Hi, I'm Byron Williams. I'm Director of the Public Interest Law Center, or PILC. PILC is an office of dedicated legal professionals, and we work with the law to advance economic and social equality. Our clients are individuals or groups who want to make changes in the areas of environmental law, human rights, consumer rights, access to justice, and the revitalization and assertion of Indigenous legal orders. Our team has helped put together this webinar series because public engagement with legal processes is a cornerstone of democracy. The ongoing climate change crisis and our shared responsibility towards reconciliation makes this engagement particularly relevant in the area of environmental law. We've invited guest speakers to share their knowledge and to improve public understanding how each of us can do our little bit more to engage in the decision-making process that impacts us all. We're so grateful that you've joined this discussion, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
My name's Glenn Korolick. I'm the Executive Director of the Manitoba Eco Network, and we're one of the sponsors of the Navigating the Law series, along with the Public Interest Law Center. For those who don't know anything about the Manitoba Eco Network, we're a nonprofit, charitable environmental organization. We've been around for about 35 years. The organization is doing some great stuff these days with all the volunteers and our new board of directors. And a good example is this webinar series, which we hope you'll enjoy. If you have any feedback after the session, please provide it to us, and we're always looking to make improvements. Once again, thank you for attending, and I hope you have an enjoyable webinar, and we'll talk to you again.
Welcome to the fourth installment of the Navigating the Law to Protect the Environment series. This is our first in our winter polar vortex series. My name is Dr. Patricia Fitzpatrick, and I am your host for today's event. As we begin, it's important to acknowledge that while many of you will be visiting and viewing from all over Turtle Island, the organizing team behind this project is working from Treaty 1 territory on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the heart of the homeland of the Métis people. We are grateful to be here. I would like to thank the Manitoba Law Foundation, who are providing financial support for this series, as well as the University of Winnipeg, who are providing financial and amazing technical support for this event. Thank you also to Patricia Deschamps from the National Captioning Canada, who is providing closed captioning for today, and to Bryce Brennan from UW, University of Winnipeg's technical support for all his help. So this webinar is titled Feet on the Ground, Your Rights When You Protest. People in Canada have often opted to voice their opinions and advocate for change on environmental issues through direct action and protest work. And so this topic is particularly relevant. And it's particularly relevant here in Manitoba, given that the government has recently announced 2 bills that will change the landscape for protest work in Manitoba. While we don't know much about the exact wording of the proposed legislation yet, the Protection of Critical Infrastructure Act and the Petty Trespasses Amendment and Occupiers Liability Amendment Act are both aimed at providing and imposing greater controls on access to specific land types for protest. Similar legislation in provinces such as Alberta has faced criticism from activists and academics. So we're thrilled to have 2 fantastic guest speakers here with us to discuss what your rights and responsibilities are and what happens when you protest. Kara Zwiebel and Emily Smith. Kara Zwiebel is a lawyer and the director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Kara was called to the bar in 2005. She has a political science degree from McGill University and law degrees from Osgoode Hall Law School and New York University. Her work with the CCLA involves providing legal opinions and research, coordinating litigation and interventions, representing the CCLA before the courts, preparing submissions to legislative bodies, and assisting with public education. Emily Teresa Smith was born in the land of the Hana people in Argentina. She grew up in Canada and currently resides in the territory of the coastal Salish people. Emily has spent much of her life in Guatemala, especially in the highland communities of the Kichi people. She is an Anglican priest, writer, and community activist. She is the co-president of the International Oscar Romero Solidarity Organization, a network of liberation theologists practicing Christians around the world, particularly focused on transforming injustice in Abya, Latin America. She's married, a mother of 3, and a grandmother of 3. And so we're so excited to have these very learned ladies here with us today to talk about their expertise and about the rights, our rights and responsibilities when we protest. During today's webinar, Kara, then Emily will each discuss their own perspectives and expertise on direct action work. Then there'll be time for both of our speakers to interact with each other. And finally, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So as you're listening to the speakers, please type your questions in the chat function. They'll be sent to the organizing team, and then Heather will facilitate the Q&A at the end. So thank you very much, and take it away, Kara.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you to the Public Interest Law Center for the invitation and for organizing this. I'm going to, I guess, try to give you a bit of a legal framework in which sort of the protest rights operate. And you know, at the very highest level, we probably know. Oh, sorry, I'm being told my audio isn't great. I'm going to move forward a little. I've been told sometimes this is an issue. Is that any better? Okay, I will stay close. Sorry, thank you for that. So, I mean, the general framework is that the Charter of Rights protects freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, and these are the rights that really inform and sort of join to build the right to protest. But those rights, like every right in the Charter, are subject to reasonable limits. So Section 1 of the Charter says that we have the rights that are in the Charter subject to reasonable limits prescribed by law that are that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So there's lots of, obviously, lots sort of packed in there. But it does mean that our rights can be limited by government. And the right to protest, although it's fundamental in so many ways, and it's very common to hear people say, but we have a right to protest. That's true. It's also true that we have a lot of laws that could be interpreted as limiting that right. So we have laws, for example, that, you know, property laws that say that you can't trespass on someone's private property, however that might be defined. We have criminal laws that talk about breaches of the peace or nuisance. We have municipal bylaws that also deal with things like nuisance, where you can set up a tent, where you can post a sign. We have highway traffic rules that talk about not impeding traffic. So all of those laws are rules that could technically be seen as and could be potentially invoked as a limit on the right to protest. But it's important that to understand that some of those laws might be challenged if they were used for those purposes and could be found unconstitutional by a court. So in Quebec, for example, during 2012, when there were widespread student protests against a potential increase in post-secondary tuition, Students were engaged in lots of protest activities, and many of them were given tickets under the basically the highway traffic law that said you're blocking the roads. When it got to court, when people challenged those tickets, the court said, this is not the purpose of this statute, right? The statute is about ensuring that the free flow of traffic, and applying it in this circumstance is not a reasonable limitation on the right to protest. So those tickets were tossed out of court. Of course, it depends on whether you're someone who has the means and the capacity to actually go to court and fight those tickets, which is a big if. So the other thing to understand is that the fact that protesters might be doing something that is technically unlawful, like trespass, doesn't necessarily mean that the police will intervene. And I've had discussions with police officers and spoken to them about rights respecting policing of protests. And they're sometimes in a difficult situation because they risk a lot of negative attention if they go in hard and try to quell a protest or quash it. They also sometimes face a lot of grief from people who say, you're not enforcing the law. People are breaking the law, and we're a country that is founded on the rule of law. So go in and enforce the law. I think that it varies quite a bit depending on where you are and the particular police force we're talking about. But some police forces have certainly had, particularly in the context of protests by Indigenous populations, they've had historical situations where they've intervened with violence, they've intervened with force, and tragedies have resulted. So Oka, Ipperwash, and there were commissions of inquiry that looked at these things. There were reports that came out of them, and as a result of some of those learnings, some police forces have learned important lessons and will not intervene to try to break up a protest or end an occupation absent a court order and a determination by the police themselves that it is operationally safe for them to go in and try to enforce that order. So this is the situation that leads us to where we are now, which is that many of the protests that we hear about, particularly when we're talking about Indigenous protests or land and water defenders, are situations where a private company, a developer, will go to court and seek an injunction. So they are asking the court to, order that an occupation come to an end, that protesters disperse. They do this on what the law calls an ex parte basis. So that means they're the only ones in court. They say, we don't have the ability to ask the protesters to come to court. We can't go serve them with materials, and we need this now. The test for getting that kind of court order is high, but it does happen frequently in these cases because we have sort of a conflict of competing understandings of the legal authorities that are at play, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So what happens is that the developer, for example, will go to court. They'll ask the court for an order. They'll ask the police to go and serve that order on the protesters or occupiers. The police may or may not do that depending on the safety of the situation. Then the protesters may decide we're not going anywhere. We don't recognize the authority of this order, or we intend to engage in a conscious act of civil disobedience and violate this order. So the developer goes back to court. They may ask for a particular enforcement order, which sort of gives the police authority to take certain action. Again, it's still operationally up to the police to decide whether they will do that or not, whether it's safe for them to do that. And then failing that, they'll go back to court and start contempt proceedings where they say these protesters, these occupiers are in open contempt of the court's orders. It's time to take further action to arrest them. Now, there's a lot of law built into all of this, and none of it really addresses the fundamental issue, which is often at the heart of the protest, particularly if we're talking about a land dispute or a dispute about the use of natural resources. There was a case many years ago in Ontario, in a place called Caledonia, where there was an occupation that was opposed to a development. And the same thing happened. The developers went to court. They got all of these orders, and the judge that had issued these orders was really angered by the fact that he kept writing these orders and sending out these judgments, and nothing changed. So the police didn't go in and drag people out because they knew it wasn't safe to do that. They knew that it was likely to result in more harm. And he issued a sort of a condemnation of the police's actions or failure to act, in his view. And this case went up to the Ontario Court of Appeal. And one of the things that the Ontario Court of Appeal said is that the rule of law is not just about the enforcement of a court order, right? This concept that we are a country that is ruled by law encompasses a lot of things. And they said we have to take into account in this understanding of the rule of law the longstanding grievances of Indigenous people in Canada and the longstanding failures of governments in Canada to effectively address those grievances. So that is something that is built in here, and we have to recognize that a judge firing off a legal order is not going to change that situation, and having the police run off and enforce it isn't going to do it either. So what all of this means, and I guess the final thing that I want to sort of add here is this question of kind of the authority of the law, because in many cases we're talking about populations that have fundamental disagreements about where legal authority really lies. And so you might have an Indigenous person who is subject to a contempt proceeding and says, I don't recognize the authority of this court. This is a colonial court. It doesn't adjudicate or deal with disputes in a way that's in keeping with my community's traditions and teachings. And when you have those fundamental disagreements, it's clear that the law, the law in whatever way we want to define it, is going to have, it can only go so far, right? It can only play a relatively limited role. So those are the kind of tensions that we're dealing with. And I think, all of this is to sort of indicate to all of you who may be involved in protest activity and activism that, there are legal risks that protesters need to consider when they're deciding how to engage in activism. It's good to be prepared to face these legal issues and to sort of understand what you might be up against. And it's not at all my intention to deter you from doing that, but to make sure that you understand and maybe even put in place some plans to deal with that possibility when you're engaged in some of these protest activities. I think that kind of captures the bulk of what I wanted to say. So, and I think probably what Emily has to say will be much more interesting to all of you, including to me. So I'm going to hand it over to her.
Well, thank you so much, Cara. I can see a whole bunch of ways that what you're speaking about really is the framework and the foundation, the skeleton of what I'm talking about. So yes, where to begin? I think I'd like to start in Guatemala, where I met where I lived for many years and a number of times over different years. And the latest period that I lived there was from 2009 to 2013. And I was very engaged in struggles there with Indigenous communities, particularly in resisting Canadian mining companies. And it was something I learned there really well. And this is what I wanted to bring to this conversation, was the absolute necessity of working together. And I think when you're talking about this fundamental disagreement about the authority of law, it really has that language about something. That's what we're doing. The Mayan community are holding on to ancient ways of thinking about the value and the worth of their land. And Canadian mining companies come and say, oh, this is worthless land, and we're going to take it and apply value to it by tearing it apart and ripping it apart and taking the gold out of it and selling the gold and leaving the garbage and nothing for you to deal with. So what Indigenous communities in Guatemala were able to do was to use the tools that are available in international law and to apply them in their situation. I'm talking particularly about the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention and the ILO Convention and Section 169, which is on the rights of Indigenous peoples for consultation around any projects that would happen in their communities. So I was part of dozens of actions of local communities using these international tools and applying these laws in their situation. And it actually works. And this is kind of what I want to bring is this hope to people, is that these kind of actions work. And it's really the collaboration. And this is where I found myself. The Indigenous people have the knowledge and the authority and the understanding of the value of their land. That's the first step. The second step is the legal conventions, both international and national, and the legal community in Guatemala that stood with the Indigenous peoples and helped them raise up. I wouldn't even call it their protest and their defense of their land, and came with the legal conventions that exist. And then the international community, which is kind of where I come in, and that visibility to that struggle that's happening in Guatemala. Now, when I came back to Canada in 2013, I began working as a parish priest in a small little church in New Westminster, and lo and behold, found that, of course, that the same kind of issues are happening in Canada. And indeed, most of the mining companies overseas are Canadian. So uh, what is my role? I'm a theologian. I'm mostly in this area, not above law at all, but kind of in a different sphere where I'm trying to think and help other people think about how it is that we do what we do and why do we do what we do and why are we acting in a certain way, and realizing that the destruction of the earth that is happening everywhere, the human cause of global climate change, is something that we really have to engage with and take on in our own sphere, wherever we find ourselves. So, myself as a theologian, I'm really thinking about how is it that we ended up in this way, and what do we think about land, and what do we think about earth, what do we think about water, and what value do we attribute to it or give to it, and how do we want to change that way that we think about the land. So when we look at a mountain, do we think about something that is useless, that has no use unless we change it and turn it into something of use? Do we look at a forest and think of it as just something that we can make money out of? What do we think about rivers? What do we think about the land? So, my work in that area of the imagination, which is really important, is like, how do we make laws? On what basis do we act out laws? How do we live our life? Um, so that's kind of the framework that I use and that I work with when I make decisions about how I act and what I do, and and what kind of laws am I going to obey. And not that you can, you can pick and choose your laws, and we all know about about the chaos that can ensue from the total disregard of law. So it's not that all law is bad, but I think all these laws and these conventions that we've created need to be tested and tried and examined for whom are they serving and who do they serve, and is there such a thing as good laws and bad laws? Of course, I mean, I'm part of the church, and the greatest shame that we carry forward into the world is our participation with the legal situation of kidnapping Indigenous children and taking them to residential schools. So that was legal, of course, but was it good? Of course it wasn't. So, how do we need to examine what is the convention for legal or not legal, and how do we need to take action upon these issues? So when the Tsleil-Waututh community here in the Coast Salish lands where I live raised up this issue of the pipeline and the so-called tank farms that had been built already on their land and were to be expanded, greatly expanded, and they asked for community participation in resisting the incursion of this pipeline. I realized that all the work that I had been doing in my head and with my writing and my activism had to come into play here as well. So there were thousands and thousands of people that went to march and to protest. And on April 24th, I'm going to get my years wrong. Now I'm starting to get to that special age where your years start mushing together. Um, 2017, right? 2018. Anyway, where a bunch of religious leaders stood and in protest against the construction of this pipeline. And a number of us were arrested that day. And it went through the whole process, and your colleague in your area, Steve Heinrichs of the Mennonite Church, was with me, and we went through the whole process together. Our court dates were all aligned, and we actually went to jail on the same day. Our our way of being in the courtroom was that we just didn't recognize this law, that the higher law of the protection of the land and the solidarity and support for the Indigenous people overrode this contempt of court. We didn't feel like we were acting in contempt of court. We felt like we were acting in accordance with a deeper law of respect and solidarity, of reconstructing a broken and shattered relationship with First Nations peoples. And the cost was, we're minimal. I went to jail for a week. It wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal in that when I went to jail, I saw who else was in jail, and the people in jail were those who had been harmed by our society, not bad guys, right? So, I mean, I think that the question of protest with our bodies is critically important. And again, it's that combination of people, the First Nations people of the land, claiming a different relationship with all of creation, and with legal teams that can recognize the tools that we have in our toolkits to protect and support that vision of the creation. And then all the rest of us coming on board to stand together. That's how change is already happening. I can say that when I was living in Guatemala, there were numerous mining projects that had their bases in Canada, and one by one, they were shut down, sometimes at great cost. I mean, people are dying protecting their land there. Women have been raped, people have been injured, and the fight certainly is ongoing. But of the 4 Canadian mines that were threatening Guatemala, only one of them is currently in operation. And that is due to that combination I spoke of Indigenous people standing for their land, the legal community standing with the Indigenous community, and then another layer of visibility, both international and local, of supporting and sustaining those two in their really creative way of thinking about how we live with one another and how we live on this precious land. So that's kind of, I guess, kind of the framework. As I said to everyone, I need about 8 hours to talk about all this, and I think I've just touched a few of these. But maybe it would be more fruitful to have this conversation with Cara, and then also to listen to what your questions might be. So
Well,
thank
you've
you.
just taken the words right out of my mouth. Thank you both for your presentation. But Cara, I wonder if you have any thoughts that emerge from such a wholesome and reflective discussion about experience internationally.
Sorry, muted again. I wanted to know if you could talk about the, I guess the legal process was one where you were, you said you were, found in contempt, and that was the, I guess, sentenced to spend some time in jail. Was there, were there civil proceedings started against you? So, because some of what we see now is that the, the developers or those that are responsible for these projects, they go to get the injunction, but they might also actually start, a lawsuit against the protesters saying, you've damaged our property, you've delayed our work, there are costs associated with this, and we expect you to, to pay for it. Now, I mean, obviously, very often they're pursuing people who are in no position to pay
barking up the wrong tree, right?
Right. But it can be,
Yeah.
a lot to sort of have held over your head for a long time.
Sure. Yeah. In my particular case, no, but I know there were different layers of people involved in this protest, and there were hundreds of people arrested over different stages. I know my sister-in-law and her priest were actually chained themselves to a tree much later in the proceedings, and there was some threat in that sense, but it was thrown out. But we were busy trying to figure out how we were going to raise, hundreds of thousands of dollars or something, but that part was thrown out. But yeah, I mean, it really is a struggle for the hearts and minds. I mean, it's not just a legal struggle, but how do the legal tools, how can they be used in this greater struggle for, I mean, it's kind of like at the level of ideas of a conceptual idea of what are we doing on this earth? How do we live with the earth? How do we protect the earth? How do we protect one another? So that's, and that's where we really need the legal, like people can, make all the lawyer jokes in the whole world they want, but the role of the legal communities I've seen in Guatemala are, there's one day I was going to visit there was a blockade of a Canadian mine it's still there. This will be their 9th year blockading a road to a gold mine that's never got off the ground because of the blockade. But I was carrying a couple of piñatas. We were going to it was the 5th or the 6th anniversary of the blockade. And I was carrying them from the market in Guatemala City. And these 2 lawyers a Sunday morning went running down the road in the other direction. And I was like, I know them. I'm like, guys, where are you going? And they were running to make some injunction against something. And I was taking the piñatas off to the protest, the blockade, and they were going off to the court. And I said, like, here we are. This is it. Like, this is the war is like they're doing their part. I'm doing my part. The Indigenous community is doing their part. And we're all working for this conceptual change in people's hearts about how are we going to live with this earth. And I think we know is every day, every year, it's more and more critical. And I think we'll have more support for a change in how we live.
Yeah, I was gonna I was going to say one of the things that we've been thinking about at the organization where I work is because so many of these issues happen, where in this pattern that I described, where you get the ex parte injunction. So you just have the one party before the court that's saying, that's giving their piece, and then not until well down the line will you ever have someone else sort of standing up to say, here's our perspective on things.
Mhm.
And we've been thinking about whether there are, mechanisms that could be created to kind of address at least some aspect of that. So I don't think this would, work in every case, and certainly, and maybe some communities would say we don't want this because we don't buy into this court process in the first place. But we've had some thoughts about whether a court should be required to do something like appoint what would be called like an amicus, or sort of a friend of the court, where they say, this is not someone who's representing a party, but someone who is here before the court should try and give the court some different perspectives that they won't hear from, the one side that is advocating for a particular result. So, I mean, I'd be curious to know what, if you could see that as being something that might be effective, or if we're sort of just, using a Band-Aid, to try and stanch a really large wound.
I think we should really feel hopeful, because we have a lot of power, and we might not recognize that. And I think that I don't really have any equipment or knowledge of how to fight this in the legal sense. That's why I say, again, I repeat, I'm so grateful to those of you who are doing that piece of work, that if we can help the world think about, if we can stand with Indigenous peoples and say, wait a minute, maybe the mountain has a soul. Maybe the mountain has memory. Maybe the mountain is worthwhile in and of its own, and not because it has gold in it. And so that's my role as a companion, as a friend, as someone who thinks coming from my own tradition. My own tradition says the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. So that means that nobody gets to own it. It's a ridiculous concept, owning the earth. Where did that come from? So that's my tradition can say that. And I know that there's an echo of that tradition in First Nations cosmology. So where does the law come in? Well, we have huge monsters that we're fighting. And the biggest piece is in this hearts and minds battle. Like, how do we think about it? How do we get people out of thinking that greed is going to solve our problems? Who came up with that crazy idea that the greedier we are, the better off we're going to be, instead of the more generous, the more compassionate, the more thoughtful, the more open to the needs of the most vulnerable? Like that, how can we rebuild our world on those concepts, on taking what is, on understanding that what we consume from the earth, we have to be responsible for. There's all sorts of things that I feel that's my job. If you want, and we need all that. The monsters are huge, and they've got all sorts of power of their own. So the more allyship we can build across these different conceptual ways of thinking, then yeah, sounds good to me. What Steve and I did when we went to court, we refused to plead. Like, we didn't plead guilty, or we didn't plead in. I mean, we stood on the road and we stopped trucks from going in, but we're coming from a way of thinking that's different. So I refused to, and I wasn't in contempt, and I wrote a letter to the judge. It's very kind of amusing. In some ways, it's like really appealing to his humanity. I think he was so confused. When I said, I have no contempt for you, he said, wait a minute, I don't think you have contempt for me. I'm like, let me finish. And he let me read my whole, 20-minute letter in the courtroom. And I think that was my victory, was being able to appeal to him and to his humanity. Like, he's a grandfather and he lost his cabin in the fires that swept across British Columbia during that terrible summer of fires that we had a couple of years ago. And I mean, I know he's stuck, like we're all trapped in our place, and he sort of had to enact the role that he had been given. But how can we kind of keep throwing wrenches in that role to help think about it differently? So that's and the role of the legal team is tremendous. And yeah, I mean,
Thanks so much, Emily. I don't want to stop your train of thought because I think it's fantastic. And honestly, I'd love to discuss the theory more as academics love their theory, especially when it comes to environmental legal theory. But to get to some of the excellent questions that we have, I think the first one I'm going to start out with, and we've got a few different versions of this, but do you have any tips for people who are interested in getting involved in environmental protests? So we had one question specifically about the do's and don'ts if you actually are apprehended by police, or if you are facing, arrest, that type of thing. So I was wondering if you both maybe had some tips to share.
Who wants to go first?
You go ahead.
Okay, I would say, first of all, never act alone. This isn't a lone wolf situation. This is about a community of people acting together. So I had the day that we had an all-night vigil, and we prayed in front of the gates, and we knelt in front of the gates, and we had a pipe ceremony, and we had drumming, we had the whole community. And it really, because it's not just my opinion or my action, it's really part of a group. And I think that those of us who are privileged, I felt like I risked very little. A discomfort, yeah, I'm eating white bread and sleeping on a rock for a week, and dealing with limit. It wasn't the first time I was arrested, but it was the first time I spent that much time in jail, and it was uncomfortable, but it was an incredible opportunity to connect and to learn from people who have been shut out of the world the way we've constructed it. And what I felt again and again is that with the women I was with, was they had been failed by our society long before they broke the law. So to me, I came out of there an enriched, more compassionate, and more committed than ever before. And I think just it's a matter of getting things lined up so you don't lose your job, and you don't, there's a lot of things I had to do to make sure my parish community. I had an old trucker who drove me to the gates the night of the vigil, and he was crying when he left me there. He's an old conservative guy, but he said, like, his heart was changed by my action. But I had to act within the context of a community, and always nonviolent, absolutely, always in the sense of the history of the power of nonviolent action in community. So that's what I would say.
So I think that I certainly don't disagree with anything that Emily has said. I obviously am not. I'm coming from a different perspective in terms of it's sort of interesting, but I do this work at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. I'm not myself someone who often does kind of take to the streets or engage in protest activity. I guess this is the way, like you're saying, this is the way I sort of try to further these goals. But I think that it's important to, I mean, certainly to be part of a community and to make sure, I think, especially now that we have this idea of being allies to groups that may have less voice. And I think that's wonderful. but you do need to make sure that that you're, communicating with them and not speaking on their behalf, right? You need to be a true ally by giving them voice and making sure that you're following their lead. I think it's it's a good idea to have legal representation that you can call on if you need to and want to have that as something that's available to you or something you've thought about before. And I also think you need to think about your own circumstances. So if you're a young person who who's in school, who's not employed right now, you do need to recognize that going to jail, getting involved with the police can have an impact on your future, right? Having a record, those are things that some people will care about. And you might make a decision that you don't want any involvement with people that care about that, and that's fine. But it's something that I think you need to you need to be aware of going in, because unfortunately, we've done work on this issue of people who forget about being sort of convicted of anything, but people who've had any sort of interaction with the police, sometimes, on a mental health call, for example, and they go to volunteer somewhere, they go to get a job, and this is something that gets disclosed, that they have some prior involvement with the police. And employers are sometimes not interested in the background story and the noble motives that you had. It's just easier to find someone who doesn't have that complication. So I think it's just something to be aware of and to think about. And
I can just clarify though that I don't actually have a criminal record. For some reason, the contempt, I don't know. I went to jail, I went through the court process, but I was told that I don't have a criminal record.
So that's why I wonder if it was there's civil contempt and criminal contempt. So it might have been a civil contempt.
It was, yeah. And I, maybe I would have changed, but I guess I have that level of privilege of a supportive congregation, a supportive family, but maybe that's why there were so many. We ended up being called the sinister seniors, right? I'm not quite senior yet, but it really is each one of us taking the risks and the responsibilities where we can. And I certainly understand that the caution and necessary caution that you would have to have.
Yeah, and I think there for sure is a difference between sort of the civil side of things, where you might get have an injunction and then face contempt, or where you might face a criminal trespass charge or a criminal nuisance charge or something like that. So those are those are things to think about and be aware of.
And there were loads and loads of people who blockaded, and then when the police, and we had this extremely privileged situation again, that the police came and asked us if we would move, asked us very nicely and very politely. So there were lots of people who weren't arrested. So that, this is how to this is a tool in our toolkit, and there's all sorts of levels of it. But I think if we see in these great movements for justice that we see in the civil rights movement, and the loads of people acting without fear to change something that's fundamentally wrong.
Just to take maybe going a little bit more of a legal direction, we've actually got quite a number of questions about legal interpretation, Kara, that I would love to ask you, but we are not going to get into that. But my question to both of you, and you've both spoken a little bit about it, is how do you see lawyers providing support for environmental protesters? So you've talked a little bit about that kind of role that we can support people. There's also the idea that you see more of a volunteer legal observers. So I was just wondering if you had some thoughts on that. And even, for example, if you were a law student or a practitioner who wanted to get more informed about how you could support protesters, do you have any suggestions on that kind of path?
Why don't you go first, Kara?
Okay, sure. So yeah, we do. I think it's an interesting thing to think about if you want to try and get legal observers to come to a protest or a blockade. People who are there's sort of different roles that legal observers can play, and they don't have to be lawyers, but they should have some training in how to do this. There are legal observers who are there and that can sort of quickly pivot to sort of defense counsel in defense of people who might be arrested or subject to orders. And then there are more sort of neutral legal observers who are there to try and document what's going on, so that when the narrative starts flying and the media gets involved and it's, the protesters were violent, the police were violent, there's someone there who can say, I was observing what was happening, and these are my observations about it, and that might be useful. That's a role that the CCLA played during the G20 protests in Toronto in the summer of 2010. We had legal observers, some of whom were arrested themselves. So it's not a risk-free proposition. And I think lawyers can also think about, to the point that I was making earlier, this idea that if we're going to have a system where, one party goes to court by themselves and tells their story, if you're a movement or an organization that has a lawyer that knows that this is an action you're going to do, you might have someone who can stand up in court for you even at that stage and try to bring the perspective forward. And it might not be the perspective that says, we recognize the court and we want the court to side with us. It's the perspective that says, here's why we don't recognize the court, or here's why we don't recognize the authority of this party that's before you. And here's the information that you're not getting from that party, right? Here's the other, some of the other perspectives.
Yeah, I think it's clear that there is a role. So it really is critically important having, as we try to negotiate this kind of turning around of the freighter, which is this way of being in the world, which is destroying the world. We need both the visionaries and those who are going to help kind of in the mechanics of it, right? So I think that idea of what we're doing is really important. But because we're facing a gigantic monster, we need all sorts of tools in every imaginable kind of way. And both, I think Kara just said it perfectly, on the site, helping, and then afterwards helping. We had wonderful folks helping us in the whole process. They couldn't shift what happened because there was no question that we were there, and they, all the RCMP videotapes of Sergeant so and this and there and blah blah blah. It was all obvious that we were there and we did what we did, and that in that sense it broke that law. But I think that having the legal people both there and in the court just helped us understand and helped us prepare for what was coming, and what was, that we could make the decision. At any time we could have decided, if we had pled guilty at any time and accepted either a fine or community service, we would not have gone to jail. And that was kind of a choice both Steve and I made, that we just were not going to cooperate with the system in any step of the way. So it was very helpful to have those options and understand them. So everything we did was clear. It wasn't a surprise.
And if I can just add, although I think it's unfortunate, but this is the reality, that in most cases, a self-represented person in the court will just not be approached the same way as someone who has legal representation by the judge. And some judges are better at this than others, and there are rules that do say, if you have a self-represented person before you are supposed to, as a judge, sort of go out of your way to make sure that they understand things, but you still have to play your role as an impartial judge. So it is difficult. And so unfortunately, I think that can give you a bit more legitimacy, even if it's the legitimacy to say, I don't recognize, my client doesn't recognize this court.
Yeah. We were fortunate in that what we really wanted was to be able to speak, and the judge allowed us. And it was quite lengthy. I think both of us spoke for probably 15 minutes or so.
So I have the unenviable position of wrapping up this riveting discussion. And I want to say on behalf of our audience and on behalf of the organizers, a huge thank you to Kara and Emily for your participation in today's event and all the fantastic information that you've shared. I think you've given me a lot for my toolkit. I'm not a lawyer, but I often encounter students who are interested in protest. And this discussion will be a great starting point for my classes with students when they're interested in this type of activity. And so I really appreciate all of the words of wisdom you've brought with us today. Thank you to our guests for joining us. Please do stick around to fill out the feedback form, which hopefully will magically appear at the end of this webinar. Fingers crossed. Next month on March 11th, the Navigating the Law series will explore how you can get involved in environmental regulatory processes. So we have two guests, Anna Johnson of the West Coast Environmental Law Society and Gloria DeSorsi of the Consumers Association of Canada, Manitoba branch. And they will bring with them a lot of firsthand experience and expertise in regulatory processes, and particularly those designed to address environmental issues. And this is particularly important in Manitoba right now. We have Bill 35, which is going to limit the powers of the Public Utilities Board to regulate Manitoba Hydro, Centre Gas, to look at Efficiency Manitoba's next 3-year plan. And so if you're interested in learning more about how to get involved in regulatory processes, I encourage you to join us. So we, the organizing committee, want to end this by wishing everyone good health and please stay warm. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And just to let people know, if anyone wants to know more about the kind of framework of that, I did send along my letter to Judge Affleck to Max, as well as my prison letters, which were published. So Max, I hope maybe if anyone's more interested in diving a bit deeper into a little bit more organized presentation of my thinking about this, that's available. And thank you so much to everyone, and to Kara, and to the whole community. It gives me so much hope to see this kind of passionate engagement with turning this world around.
Thank you.